Welcome to the Content Champion podcast. We provide the training and tools to help you become a content marketing champion in your online business. Introducing your host, the content champion himself, Loz James.
Hi guys, welcome to the Content Champion podcast. Thanks as ever for listening. I really appreciate you being here. Now on the show this time, it is my complete honor to be discussing podcast monetization with one of the very first people I ever started following online, the internet marketing expert, online entrepreneur, coach, blogger and podcaster, Yaro Starak, founder of entrepreneursjourney.com. I can remember reading Yaro's blog way back in 2005, and I've learned so much from him in the 12 years since. So it was a genuine pleasure to host such an internet marketing pioneer on the show. With all that said, let's dive in. Thanks for coming on, Yaro.
Thanks for having me, Loz.
Now, before we drill down into making money from our podcast, could you tell us how your journey into online marketing began, please?
Yeah, it's a long story, so I'll give you the short version so we have time to talk about podcasting still. I started online in 98. That was my first online business. It was, as you can imagine for the time, a fairly amateur website, but it grew and it was dedicated to a card game I played in university called Magic the Gathering. It's a collectible card game. It's competitive. There's tournaments. There's a trading card scene. So I was totally into that game as a teenager. And that was my first website. And it actually was my first sort of business. I had a little card store there, made some money from advertising, and really got a lot of basic training in how to grow traffic and, grow a business online. And then I graduated from university and went all in on another company. I call it my first real business, which was an essay editing service for university students, usually coming from English as a second language background. And I had a team of editors who did essay and thesis editing for them. And that was my business for a good 5 years while I was in university and really seriously after graduating, and paid my living, was a real laptop lifestyle business, had a lot of, free time, was systematized. And eventually I had other people running it for me. And it was because of that business that I got into blogging. So the connection there is blogging was becoming a thing in 2004, roughly 2003, 2004. I didn't really know what a blog was. I just had static websites up to that point. And I had to basically install one to figure out what makes a blog different from another normal website. And I learned about blogging. I attempted to start a blog about editing for the editing business, which didn't last very long. It was about 3 months in 2004. But I did want to explore writing more. So in 2005, I started the Entrepreneur's Journey blog, which is meant to be a hobby, just a place to share stories from my previous entrepreneurial projects, everything I told you about there. And it took off. And because blogging was booming, I was actually, one of the first people to start making money from blogging. And I think one of the first people to start teaching how to make money from blogging too. There was only a handful of other people around at the time. So I had one of the first courses on this subject. And I also launched a podcast. So that's where this connects. I actually got on podcasting really early. It was the first year of my blogging in 2005. Within 6 months, I started podcasting as well. And to cut the last 12 years short, I've been basically doing the same thing since then, running the blog, running the podcast, and teaching people the art and craft of selling digital products online through blogging, email marketing, and podcasting.
Well, look, this is one of those sort of starstruck moments, because I've been online since, my first website was about, 2000 when I started as a copywriter. And I was looking around for people for advice online. And there was Brian Clark, copy blogger. There was Pat Flynn, Smart Passive Income, and then yourself. And I can remember starting a newsletter in 2005 as a copywriter after reading a post on your blog and downloading your ebooks. That's like about 12 years ago. So to have you on the show now for me on my podcast is just like amazing, and I can hardly talk properly. So tell us about, you mentioned podcasting then. Tell us about your podcasting backstory, because I know, as you've mentioned, it's formed an important part of your business. So what are the benefits of podcasting in this context?
Yeah, well, podcasting for me was, again, an experiment. You have to put it into context for the time. There were no examples of you couldn't look at Lewis Howes or Pat Flynn or John Lee Dumas. That's just in my industry, our industry, as these really huge podcasts getting global exposure, millions of downloads. There was no iTunes. There was no, iPod had just come out, and that was why it was called a podcast. As far as I was concerned, it just looked like audio blogging. You put up a blog post with audio content instead of written content. So for me, it was an experiment to see what it was like to do that. It was a bit of a combination of luck as well, because I had purchased an iRiver MP3 player, which was a competitor to the iPod at the time in 2005. And it had a microphone jack on it, which the iPod didn't. So I was able to hit a record button on this portable MP3 player and talk into it. And it created a WAV file, which was still a little tricky to convert into an MP3, but I found some software to do that and uploaded it to my blog. And my first, I think, 3 or 4 episodes were me talking just for 15 minutes about something I was interested in regards to entrepreneurship and marketing and business. And that was it. It was really simple. There was no networks or distribution. I think Odeo, which eventually would turn into Twitter, was around at the time or just getting started. So it really was just because I had a blog, I decided to have audio content as well. And then I think one of the biggest changes for me, which will seem so ridiculously simple now, but for me, it was a switch. I started interviewing people. I actually invited a friend of mine who had a small business in where I was from in Brisbane, Australia, about internet marketing. And we had a conversation, which I recorded. I think that was probably the first Skype recording. Here we are still using it, which is pretty impressive, to create a podcast interview. And that really got a lot more interest, I think, than just me doing these short solo episodes. So I started seeking out more entrepreneurs, and it was kind of a little bit ad hoc. Like I was all over the place just through my networks and people I was meeting and getting introduced to because of blogging. I would often say, hey, do you want to jump on my podcast and start doing interviews? And that's how it kind of happened to begin with. And it was very sporadic. Like I always saw myself as a writer before an audio person. So blogging was sort of second. And podcasting was second, sorry. And because of that, I kind of published very randomly. 1 month I'd have an episode, then the next month I'd have 2, and then maybe I'd skip 2 months. And that's why I never sort of amassed these 500 episodes so quickly, like John Lee Dumas did in more recent years, doing an episode a day. But it still was incredibly effective. And I really noticed the effectiveness. And this is where I guess my strategy came from. The effectiveness of doing interviews for 2 reasons. One was simply to hear my voice and hear my expertise come through, even if I was the one not getting interviewed, just, guiding the interview. And 2, interviewing people who were doing things similar to what I was doing and eventually what I was teaching. And that really became the foundation of my strategy, certainly in the last 3 or 4 years, more than ever. I guided my podcast or not really guided, I narrowed in my niche focus to be more about the kind of people who are examples of what I teach, which is how to make money from blogging, email marketing, and selling your own digital products. So I started to really, I would say ignore all other types of entrepreneurship, but we look for people who are doing that and making a full-time income, maybe traveling around the world. So they have an expertise. Like just last podcast I published as I'm talking to you was with Graham Cochran, and he's a mixer of music, and he teaches people through video and content on his blog how to mix and produce music. And he's got $500,000 a year business doing that with teaching products. So he's a perfect example of the kind of person I tend to focus on now. And to even extend that principle further, I did interview graduates of my main course. That was sort of another kind of story I could share with you, how that came about, unless you want to go in a different direction, because it really was a shift in my business when that happened.
No, let's go down that route, because it all ties in with monetizing the podcasting model. Okay. And I know that's something you've had a lot of success with. Yeah,
I mean, it was an interesting time for me because, I should clarify, there was a period around 2011 to 2013 where I had a startup, and I didn't quit blogging, but all my courses were taken off the market because they were dated, and I wasn't really making money in the way I had been previously. Kept my blog going, kept my podcast going, but I had a startup, and I was focusing with my partners on that, spending most of the business time I had on that. And during that time, I kind of discovered that I guess I should say I re-fell in love with the kind of business I had before the startup. I was a little bit burnt out from creating courses by 2011, but after 2 years of running the startup, I realized how much better it is to be running this kind of business where, you're running an email list, you're writing articles, you don't have to put 12-hour days in like these startup guys do and, try and get funding and just hustle so much. I much prefer what I call laptop lifestyle, that more casual lifestyle driven business. So I went back to it in 2013. But for me, there was a bit of a challenge because by that stage, the market had really shifted, especially I had a really big run, huge success, 2008, 2009, 2010. Then I'm sort of disappearing for 3 years, no products, no launches and so on. And I come back and there's a lot of more competition. Like that's when Pat Flynn had well and truly become, well known. And there was all these, I almost say hundreds of women teaching women how to do business as well. Like the Marie Forleos, one of my students, Natalie McNeil, so many different people teaching business, and it just magnified. So I felt like I needed to figure out where I fit in that space. And I almost gave up my topic. I literally was about to start another blog and go from scratch. But before I did that, I did something that I'm glad I did. I sent an email to all my past customers of my main course, Blog Mastermind. And I said, I want to do podcast interviews with anyone who's had success, who's basically made at least a full-time income from their blog. And my course was somehow part of their journey. And I had a bunch of people. It was like 10 to 20 people who said, listen, I took your course in 2007 or 2008. And, now I'm running a 6-figure blog. Or even Natalie McNeil was doing over $1 million a year already. So it was like this kind of wake-up call that there were all these case studies within my database of past customers. So I spent a month, which was probably one of the best months of my life, interviewing people who said nice things about me in my course and then talking about how much money they made because of me, or somewhat because of me. I recommend that to anyone who's teaching if you get a chance to do it. It's a lot of fun. And I created all these case studies, and they weren't like sales pitches. They were still following my format with my podcast, which very much represents my blog. It's entrepreneur's journey. I tell a story. As I interview the person, I make them go back in time and talk about what they did before they had business success. So we kind of get their chronology. It's very much my main podcasting strategy now. So I did those interviews with these people, and I realized, this is really powerful content. It's amazing proof for my business. I'm going to relaunch a new version of my course. I'm going to put these people first and say, listen, look at the amazing success stories. And, to this day, I think I would say almost half, maybe even more of my customers, my new customers that have come through in the last 3 and 4 years since I did those case studies, will cite those case studies, even if it was just one of them that they listened to. And they said, I want to be like that person. And I love their story, and it made it accessible. And I want to follow your methodology. So I bought your course. So it's been a huge part of, as you said, my podcasting monetization strategy, which is a little bit left field. It's not direct monetization, it's indirect monetization. But I'm happy to talk more about that.
Well, that's the fascinating thing about the models you use for podcasting, which we are going to go and talk about later in the show. But you touched upon something else then in that answer, and it was the technical stuff involved in podcasting, because this is often overestimated by people who want to start a podcast. I mean, I started as a broadcast journalist. We used to have these things called viewers, which had sort of tapes inside that you had to cut and mark with a Chinograph pencil and then stick them all together. So editing was fantastically hard. Now, the softwares and the solutions you can use like Skype and Audacity and things make podcasting from a technical point of view that much easier, don't they?
Yeah. I mean, I guess even with my first podcast, using the microphone on a portable MP3 player it's a bit ghetto, a bit hacked together, but it did the job. The harder part, I think, was just uploading making the MP3 from it, uploading it. And then as time progressed, microphones came out, podcasting became a thing. So there's way more support, way more software. I mean, when I first launched my podcast, there was no Libsyn or Amazon S3, for example, for hosting the MP3 file itself. You just stuck it on your web server, which wouldn't work well today for a lot of the lower priced web servers. They just couldn't handle that kind of traffic. But, it is really easy. Like I'm literally talking to you right now just with my built-in MacBook Pro microphone. Because I've been traveling, I didn't pack a mic. I wanted to be as minimalist as I could, get my weight down in the suitcases. And I got a new MacBook Pro and I felt, the mic, it's not perfect. It's not going to be studio quality, but you can hear me and we're having a conversation. And like you said, we're recording it on Skype. And that's kind of been my story from my technical story of podcasting almost from the beginning. I'm still using Skype like we are now. I'm usually using a microphone. That is the one difference. I've had the Snowball by Blue and I had the Rode Podcaster microphone. But like I said, right now it's me plugged into headphones talking to you. And I think it's good enough to get started. In terms of software, I think that's been the trickier part because, I don't see myself as an editor. I'm not strong in that sort of area. I do some video editing for some of my products, but even that I try to minimize. And I've used ScreenFlow. And in fact, I'm now using ScreenFlow, even though it's a video editing product, for editing together podcasts I do as well, because you can pretty much produce the same kind of quality. And it's so easy for me to use the tool. I did use Audacity, like you said in the past. For a while, I used GarageBand that came with Mac computers as an entry-level product, but then they made some changes to it and became less easy to use for podcasting. Yeah, it's not hard. And I think what's become especially good about it is the support services that are available. You can find countless people who will do all the editing, the balancing of volume, the removing of any hiss or background noise, and send you back an MP3 or even upload it for you. You can, outsource the entire production part. And all you have to do is show up, do the interview, and then put the raw file off to a team who will then do everything and get everything ready. And that's amazing support. So it's actually in a lot of ways easier than blogging is because, you still need a WordPress blog, but you don't have to worry about writing and adding pictures and adding, potentially so much more content than just having a conversation with someone like we're doing now, right? So, it depends on your strong point if you like audio versus writing, but it's certainly accessible. Podcasting is very accessible.
And I guess the editing of the show after the fact is made easier if you have a structure. And moving into monetization strategies as well, you talk about telling your guests stories. And I guess that's to do with the flow of the conversation as well, isn't it? If you create a great story behind each guest, that helps you to really produce a quality interview that can then feed into the monetization process as well.
Yeah. I mean, storytelling, I find this interesting because most podcasts I listen to, even in my industry, don't really do storytelling as the main, the entire podcast, basically, like I do. If you have listened to pretty much every single podcast I've done, or maybe 95% of them, it will be a beginning and end journey. I literally will ask a person to go back and tell me what they did, even in university and high school, and where they grew up in a city, and whether they were entrepreneurial then or did it become later? Did they go to sort of take a degree in university? And we move forward to the point where they might have some failed projects. So we learn about those and what they learned from failing, then how they got their initial project going. And we really dive deep into, traffic and what their product or service was and how they built their team if they have one. And then you get to the end of the podcast and you feel like you've actually experienced the whole process they went through. Even my guests feel similar. They go, wow, this is almost like cathartic for me. That was a therapy session to go back over my history and see what I've achieved over the last 10 years or 5 years or whatever. And I think because it's delivered in a narrative, this is really key. The narrative is way more engaging than a lot of the podcasts where you'll find someone just jump from one point to a next and say, tell me about that. Then they'll say, oh, tell me about that. And it doesn't really make a story. It's just sort of like bullet points of how people solve problems or what they were thinking or something like that. So it's difficult to really feel a strong connection with the chronology. So, I remember, it's so funny, but listening to some of the best podcasters, people consider the best podcasts now in my space, but listening to them during their early days, people like, Andrew Warner from Mixergy and even Tim Ferriss with his podcast. You listen to their first podcast and they're just terrible. Like Andrew, I remember, was really struggling to kind of not talk about himself a lot on the podcast, right? And I could tell that he was still trying to come up with his own style. There's a learning curve there. And I have to say, like even with my journey process, I had to figure that out as well. Like it worked for me because I was introverted and didn't want to talk about myself. So just being curious about someone else's journey. But before that, I had to do the whole solo episode thing and try and talk by myself. And that's where I had, I guess, like what Andrew had, you kind of struggled to figure out, where's your strength and where you're going. So it's something that takes a bit of time, but I still teach, and this is what I recommend to everyone in all my training around podcasting, is get storytelling in it, ideally for the whole episode if you can. I don't know how much storytelling. We started with a bit of my story. So, that's what gets the engagement and creates the connection in the brain. There's actually science behind this. You can look at some MRIs of brain waves, and telling a story will activate parts of the brain that not telling a story won't. So it's whether you're writing content or doing audio content, it makes a huge difference. And then to connect that to monetization, if you have a more engaged listener with a podcast, they're more likely to stay through the whole episode. My episodes are long. They're usually an hour. Some are even over an hour. We're not talking, your 15-minute drive in the car interview. It's a journey. It's an hour. So if you get someone to go through that whole process, that's a lot of time spent with just you and your listener and your interview guest. So that's pretty powerful for creating a connection. And it's very likely to lead to a more likely customer, a purchase, if they're in the market for what you sell, because they will think of you as, I really liked that interview. That person knows what they're talking about. I've heard so many interviews now of this example of it working in terms of a course, then they go and buy your course. So I think it's a very effective way to make money from a podcast.
You're listening to the Content Champion podcast, showcasing the training and tools you need to become a content marketing champion in your online business.
Talking about the structure there, I sent you some questions in advance. I try to do that with all my guests and then kind of have a central theme running through that we return to. So there is a kind of thematic story running through that keeps us on track. And then the stories go in and out of that as well. And I guess without trying to make an attempt to create that engagement, you're never going to get the audience size that you want. And that brings us into monetization, because I guess for most people, they're not going to get the audience ever that's large enough to justify an advertising model or to make that successful. So is that a bit of a fallacy to start your podcast and just think, okay, I'm going to get a huge audience like John Lee Dumas and then I could just sell advertising on it? For most people, that's not going to work, is it?
No, and this is advice I give to everyone, bloggers, podcasters, anyone who's looking to monetize content. It's very difficult, especially today, to go with the advertising route, because how much you get paid per advertisement display has dropped. You do require an incredible amount of page views, or if we're talking podcasts, downloads of your episode, even 10,000 per episode just as a basic entry point to start making, good money. And that's not easy. And that's okay, because some people are happy to just push hard and go after the big numbers and they'll just market like crazy. But you have to be in it for that game. You got to go, you know what? I'm all about that. I'm going to try and be huge downloads and therefore make good money from advertising. But 99% of the people won't do that or won't even want to commit to that process. And I actually like the, small niche target audience who really love what you do and then buy your stuff as a result of consuming your content, including your podcast. And that's when you can do well with, 500 downloads an episode, 1,000 downloads an episode, because those 1,000 people, I really think in my own podcast, I probably have 1,000 hardcore listeners. That's it. Sure, I've had, over 1 million downloads over the course of my podcast, but I really think there's only 1,000 people there who actually listen to every episode from start to finish. And those are the ones who will buy my product if I'm the right person for them at the right time. When they're ready to take a course based on what I teach, then they'll choose me. And that's partially because of the podcast, but it's not a huge amount of people. It's just a very targeted group of people. Now, advertising, it's something I have considered in the past, because you do sort of see the numbers that some people get, like Tim Ferriss's ridiculous 30,000 an episode for, these little intros and outros.
I can't even get my head around that many podcast listeners.
Oh, yeah, it's ridiculous. So, but he's such an outlier, and he's a super famous author. Now he's a kind of like a mainstream celebrity almost. So that's an advantage already. Like his podcast becomes famous because he's famous. So it's, you don't want to get this in the wrong order. It's not like the podcast made Tim famous. Tim was famous, which helped the podcast become famous and also helped with its connection for guests. Most of us are going to start and we're going to be, struggling to get certain guests. We're going to try and get a level of expert and then level up and get someone more famous. And hopefully, that will get us more traction. But if we're striving for those kind of numbers for advertising, it's pretty easy to get depressed and disappointed by your lack of results. And that's what kills almost all podcasts and blogs. It's not for a sense of things failing. It's just the person producing the content feels like it's failing, feels like it's not going anywhere. So if you have a strategy that really sets yourself up for success, you only need even 100 downloads, and you can get to 100 in a month, and you're like, wow, this is working. And then you get your first sale from those 100 people. You're like, I just need to 10x this, and I'm making a full-time income. That's realistic. That's 1,000 downloads, not 10,000 or 100,000. So, that to me sets yourself up for success by managing expectations and choosing a smarter monetization model. At the end of the day, that's all we're doing here, is choosing to make money from products that you can make $1,000 from selling one course, as opposed to making 10 cents for one listener listening to an ad or something like that, or even 2 cents or 1 cent or something like that. So the numbers work out a lot better that way too.
And aside from the fact, just personally, that it's an absolute thrill to be able to talk to people of your standing on a podcast. I love podcasting. Just as a fact, if we park that over there for a minute, the other side of it is that I've only done 68 podcasts in about 2.5 years, and it's probably generated me tens of thousands of pounds worth of business from selling services without really having to try that hard. And it's because it helps people, as you say, get that core listenership, and people trust you and they trust your authority. And it can really help you, even though it's a niche audience and it's not that big, to promote your own business. So, that kind of dovetails neatly to the monetization sort of methods that you recommend. And you talk about promoting existing products and services, and also selling access to podcasts themselves as products. So walk us through these, if you would, please.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's a little unusual. You don't hear a lot of people charging money for podcast content. And I to be fair, it's not really, these are just labels. You could call it a podcast. You could call it an audio course. You could call it interviews. I just remember when I had this thought, it was actually back when I rebooted my business in 2013-ish, 2012, 2013. I was like, I get all this feedback from people enjoying the podcast. Why don't I have a next level product? And really, to put it into bigger context, the core idea I was rebuilding my business around was what's called the sales funnel. And I'm sure you know all about it. Was with always having a next level product that people can buy. So, there might be an entry level, there's a free something first, and then the free thing might sell a lower price product under $50. And you have, your $500 course or your $300 course, and then all the way up to your flagship course, which might be $1,000, $2,000, to even bigger things like conferences, boot camps might be $3,000, $5,000, and private coaching, which could be $10,000, $20,000 a year. And that's a sort of teaching model that a lot of experts use online and even offline. And I was keen to build that out. I'd never really built that out. I had only ever just had these $500 courses before. So I was restructuring my business. I'm thinking, I don't have a next step for a podcast listener. I don't have a course on podcasting, which I now do. And I don't have if you enjoy these interviews and you want to buy more of them, here's something you can buy. So for the hardcore fans of the interview, and I decided to put it together and to create a program around that. So it wasn't that complicated. It was simply the same format, doing interviews, but more targeted. So, we can take any kind of example of a person listening to this episode. Let's say you have a podcast on maybe skateboarding, and you're talking about skateboarding, and you want to create a product around the same subject using podcasting or audio content. You might go, I'm going to create a podcast that only interviews the very, best people about the subject of competitive skateboarding. So it's going to be my competitive skateboarding product, that happens to be all interviews with pro skateboarders. Now, it can look very similar to your free podcast that you give away for free every week or month or whatever. But the difference is you tie it around an audience need. So becoming a professional skateboarder is probably a very clear need to that audience. So if you have this product where you can say, get, interviews with the best people about this subject only, plus maybe a little bit of extra something, like I did action plans to go with the episode. So I recorded interviews with entrepreneurs and then I took out what I thought were the highest leverage points from their interviews and created action plans. It ended up being a kind of like a 6-month to 12-month subscription service that was 2 interviews a month with entrepreneurs plus 1 action plan each month. And that's what I built. So the key there was pretty simple. I would say, here's my free podcast. If you want more of my free podcast, make sure you subscribe to my email newsletter for free podcasts. Oh, and here's my product, which is a subscription service. And, it's $29 a month. You'll get a premium interview every month or every 2 weeks, plus a handout. And I had a proper sales page for it, all about it, copywriting. And I sold this product. In fact, it was the very first product from my rebooted business I created, because it was going to be also my upsell for all my other products. It was very much a strategy that whenever a person would buy, for example, in the future, I wrote ebooks, I'd offer the opportunity to have a 1-month free trial of this podcasting product to tag on with the purchase. And if they didn't cancel it, they'd get ongoing podcast at $29 a month. So for the next 2 years, I literally built my business around ebooks and this audio podcasting product. And it was, definitely not my best selling product. I mean, it's a low price product, but it brought in a lot of new customers. And I love the fact that I had something I could say to people, hey, if you love my podcast, here's more of the same. Go subscribe, $30 a month, or there was a one-time payment option as well if they wanted everything up front. And it was responsible for a big chunk of my income during the first 2 years of the reboot. Plus, I loved the fact that it was an upsell to other products. I was really keen on that funnel process. So being able to create bundles and packages, it just gives you options. So I really enjoyed that. That was one way I monetized podcasting. The other way we kind of already talked about, which was using it as a tool to promote what you do. So whether it's like your self-laws when you're, selling services, whether it's consulting or copywriting, coaching, software development, whatever it is you do, a podcast is a fantastic marketing tool to promote what you do, especially if you do case studies. I love the idea of find your past clients, interview them to explain how what you did helped them get an amazing result. If that's great teaching content, it's also great marketing content. So I love that. Those are the main 2 tools I've used to monetize podcast content. I do promote the odd affiliate thing, but it's not been my main strategy. It just makes sense sometimes to mention that, I use, Aweber as my email list provider or Bluehost as my hosting or something like that. But predominantly it's been my own products or turning audio content into a product itself.
Okay. And the key to this as well, even if you're a small business listening to this, you might be a physio or a plumber or whatever you do, and you're thinking about podcasting in your content marketing mix. It's not about the size of the audience. It's about the quality of the audience, isn't it? And you can have that very niche audience and be very successful. So when you're promoting your podcast, you've got to bear that in mind, haven't you?
Oh, yeah. And you're a great example, I think, Loz, with this, because, copywriters, what's one client worth to you? I would say similar real estate agents. What's one sale listing worth to you, right? So it's way different to try to sell maybe a $10 ebook where you do kind of need volume. I think that if that's your only product for sale and you're hoping a podcast is going to make you rich, you're going to have the same issue of needing a larger audience because you just need to sell thousands of copies ongoing of this book. And it's been done, but it's just making it harder for the numbers. But if you're in a space where 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 or 20 new clients or new customers is actually really valuable. Like if I get 10 new course customers, that's $10,000. So, if I have 1,000 listeners to a podcast episode and 10 of them eventually buy, the numbers there aren't difficult to fathom as realistic, 1% conversion rate, right? So that can convert to a good amount of money. So, if you are a chiropractor and you can get 2 or 3 new clients a month coming in from a podcast, I think you'd probably say that's worth it. So yeah, you got to look at your numbers, obviously. But the idea is, as you said, a small, high quality, very targeted, very interested, very engaged audience who are either about to make a purchase or just in that lead up process where they're doing the research to get ready to make a purchase. And you'll be the person they think of when they are ready to buy it. It's another tool we have in our marketing toolkit.
And in terms of promotion, I know we could do a whole call on this, and you've been very generous with your time, but in terms of promotion, it's simply then going to where that niche audience is online or offline and drawing their attention to your show, isn't it?
Yeah, well, there's a few things to this. I mean, the one thing, not an advantage for me and maybe not you, but if you're listening to this and you've got perhaps a subject matter that's not super popular on the internet in terms of podcasts, like I don't know how many chiropractors are doing, the How to Fix a Bad Back podcast, right? So chances are, if you get out there and take it seriously and create a podcast of, consistent content, doesn't have to be every day, maybe once a week or every 2 weeks, but you put in the effort to create a good show. I love to think about a podcast show, especially a new one, as a sequence of content as well. It's almost like you're creating a mini course because you could do each episode as a subject towards, solving a problem. With a bad back, you could look at all the different angles of a bad back as a chiropractor. And you're not going to face a ton of competition. So simply being in iTunes is going to be a good start. And from a promotion standpoint, if you go out there and try and say, get interviewed on whatever, some kind of a blog, it could be an online magazine, could be an offline magazine or a newspaper, it could be a radio show, whatever the case may be, saying that you're a chiropractor who podcasts in itself is kind of like news. So you've got a story, an angle, a hook there. Not all of us can do that because, I'm one of many people who blog about making money and, have a podcast about business and entrepreneurship. So saying I podcast about that subject is not enough of a story to get me through the doors. But if you can find that hook, that angle, that claim to fame somewhere within your story, that's what you need to start getting the traffic. Like I always say this to all my students, whether it's podcasting, blogging, before you go out there and put in all this effort to knock on doors, whether it's, like I said, approaching for guest writing or interviews on podcasts, or it's even simple things like posting in Facebook groups, forums, getting in touch with anyone who you want to make a connection with who might be a potential guest or audience exposure point for you, even just a great contact. You want to get clear on your angle, or it's often called like a differentiation point. I really think it's bigger than that, though. It's like the message behind your brand. What do you stand for? That's unique and interesting. I like the idea of the phrase big idea. What's your big idea? That if you said to people, I do this, and that they go, oh, wow, that's interesting. I want to know more about it. And you have to massage that idea for a while. It can be a bit difficult. Often for some people, it's challenging to figure out because you feel like you have lots of big ideas. I feel like myself, I have this challenge because I want to go out there and say, I love podcasting. I love blogging. Oh, I love selling information products. I love courses. Oh, I love ebooks. I love creating audio content, or, all these different angles you can go out there with. But you have to find that sort of door opening hook that you can take, which usually, going back to what we talked about earlier, is wrapped up in a story. It's the chiropractor who became a chiropractor after having some sort of experience working in Africa and helping, doing surgeries on backs there. And, then creating a story around that. It could be a story from a client. It could be your own story, but it's what gets interest from media. And that's, I think, the strongest free source of traffic. We haven't talked about paid traffic like, Facebook ads, Google ads, email ads, those sorts of things. But if we're talking about content marketing, it only works on the strength of your story. So everyone should spend some time thinking about that first. Then you go out there and start knocking on doors, and you do it every day. That's like, if you want to grow a podcast and you really want to get that sort of initial core traction, that core audience, like you said, you have to go where your audience already is, and you have to have your unique story so that, if I said to, like, if going back to how you and I started, if I came across Laz and said, hey, Laz, I'd love to come on your show. I've got a unique way of making money from podcasting. I don't think anyone's ever talked about on your show. It's got to do with, actually charging money for your audio content, something I've been doing for 5 years now. And you go, oh, that's interesting. I want to share that, right? So I need to lead with that angle first before people will say yes. And then we're doing an interview because of it, something like that. So that's what you're looking to do in your industry, find that unique angle.
And as an aside to that as well, to the UK audience listening, podcasting is growing in the UK. So if you're positioned with a great brand story and you have that unique message that you can share with your audience, podcasting, getting on the bandwagon with podcasting in the UK now is a very good thing to do, I should think. So, okay. Been a great conversation. I could literally talk to you all day. It's amazing hearing your voice coming through Skype, having listened to you for 10 years and followed your podcast and all your work. So just before the PS question, there's a great course, Power Podcasting, which I own and recommend. Fantastic. A lot of the subject matter we've been talking about is in there. So can you remind us where we can find you online, Yaro, and tell us about all your courses and information?
Yeah, the simplest way is just to Google my name, Yaro, Y-A-R-O. You'll find me usually first or second page, and you'll find the Entrepreneur's Journey blog there. That's easiest to spell, easiest to remember. If you're looking for the podcast, you'll find it there on my blog as well, and you can dive in and take a look at all my training content. But that's all you need to remember, Y-A-R-O.
Fantastic.
Wait for it, listeners. Here comes the PS question.
Okay, this is what I call the PS question. Could you please share one advanced podcast-related content marketing tactic that we can use right after the show?
Sure. Well, since we're talking about podcasting, and I think interviewing has clearly come through as a sort of standard practice for podcasting, good quality podcasting, what I recommend people do, well, two things I'll say. Have a go at the storytelling formula. I think you know it, Laws, because you went through my course and I talk heavily. It was a whole module on just the storytelling interview formula. So try and focus on that in your episodes if you're interviewing people. And there's a reason why I'm recommending that. It's because what you want to do is get your guest feeling like they've just given something really special on your episode in particular. This is important because, and this is a simple truth, one of the best sources of traffic, quick traffic, and really high quality traffic is to have the person you just interviewed heavily promote the episode that you just did with them. Now, for some people, that's less likely. If they're interviewed on a podcast every day or very frequently, they're not going to send an entire email to promote just your episode, because they'd have to do that once a day for every episode they're involved with. And then their audience would be like, stop sending me only interviews with you. It's getting over the top, right? But you can be strategic about this. If you produce a great interview and you go after a guest who perhaps is not super exposed in the podcast format, then you can just ask them at the end, what can you do to help get your story out to more people? And if they really loved that interview because of the storytelling formula, they'll email it to their newsletter if that's their strongest platform. Maybe their YouTube channel is their strongest platform, and they'll say, go listen to this episode, whatever their platform is that has the most audience. I mean, maybe they have a radio show in the real world or a TV show, or they write an article for a big magazine or newspaper. Usually it's an email newsletter. I don't know many examples where that's anything better than that. So you can say, would you, share this with your audience through email? And that will bring you the most new subscribers to your show and the most downloads. It doesn't happen frequently in my space because it's just such a crowded space now that, people don't email out their interviews as much as they used to. But going back to our original sort of topic there, if you are a new UK podcaster and you're interviewing people who are just not overly saturated, do a great interview, ask them to share it on their email newsletter, and they'll probably say yes. And that can be, if you get 2 or 3 or 4 people to do that, suddenly you've got 1,000 subscribers and away you go. So it can work really well, really quickly.
Well, that's a fantastic answer to the PS question. A great interview. And yeah, it's been an absolute honor to talk to you, Yaro. As I say, I've been following your journey for 10 years and I'll continue to do so. It means a lot to me that you've come on the show, and I'd just like to wish you every success with everything in future.
Thank you, Lars. It's been a lot of fun, and great to speak to someone who took my course. I didn't realize you had, so that's awesome. And good luck, everyone listening, with your own podcast. It can really change your life.
You've been listening to the Content Champion podcast, available at contentchampion.com and on iTunes. Until next time, thanks for listening.